260 billion pounds of Russia's own money was frozen inside Western banks in the very first week of this war. It has been sitting there for years, while lawyers argued about what to do with it. Then the United Kingdom stopped waiting. It started turning Vladimir Putin's own frozen fortune into drones, missiles, and radar systems aimed straight back at the army he sent into Ukraine. Not stolen, not confiscated outright. Something far cleverer, and something the Kremlin cannot actually stop. So how exactly did Britain manage to weaponize Russia's own money without breaking international law? And why is Moscow's own spokesman calling it theft while doing absolutely nothing to get the money back? Let's go through exactly how this works and why it has Putin in a position he cannot talk his way out of. To understand what the UK is actually doing right now, you have to go back to the very first days of the war, because that is when this entire story began. According to the International Crisis Group, on February 28, 2022, just days after Russia's full-scale invasion, the European Union, the United States, Canada, Britain, and Japan jointly blocked the transfer or use of bonds, deposits, and cash owned by Russia's own central bank denominated in the currencies of those sanctioning countries. Switzerland and Australia followed soon after. The total amount frozen since then has reached roughly 300 billion euros, or about 335 billion US dollars in cash, bonds, equities, real estate, and even yachts. The overwhelming majority of that money belongs to Russia's central bank. Most of it sits in one place, held in accounts managed by Euroclear, a Belgium-based financial institution. According to DW and the Council on Foreign Relations, the largest single pool, around 191 billion euros, is held at Euroclear in Brussels. Roughly $50 billion sits in Japan. Smaller amounts are scattered across the United States, Britain, Canada, and other European Union member states. The UK's own share is around 25 to 30 billion pounds, a figure the British government has confirmed publicly. Here's the part that makes this whole situation so strange and so frustrating for Ukraine's allies for years. That money has not simply been sitting in a vault doing nothing. Bonds mature. Cash deposits generate interest. And according to Euroclear's own 2024 annual results, the interest earned on cash balances from those Russian-sanctioned assets reached approximately 6.9 billion euros in 2024 alone. That's almost 7 billion euros in 1 year, paid to a Belgian financial institution, generated by money Russia is not allowed to touch. That is the crack in the door. The European Union decided that the interest did not count as sovereign Russian property in the same way the underlying assets did. It was new profit, generated after the freeze rather than Russia's own original funds. And that legal distinction, treating windfall profits differently from the underlying principle, became the foundation for everything that followed. Because once you accept that interest is fair game, you have just opened the largest piggy bank in modern history, and you have handed the key to Ukraine's allies. The first real breakthrough came in October 2024. According to the G7's joint statement in the U.S. Treasury, the G7 group of nations agreed to provide Ukraine with a $50 billion loan to be repaid entirely using the extraordinary revenues, meaning the windfall interest earned on those frozen Russian assets. The mechanism was called the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Initiative, or ERA loans. The United Kingdom's specific contribution came to £2.26 billion, roughly $3 billion. The United States contributed $20 billion of that same program by December 2024. Here's how the U.S. side worked. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen announced the disbursement of $20 billion for the benefit of Ukraine, describing the funds as paid for by the windfall proceeds earned from Russia's own immobilized assets. They flowed through the World Bank's FORTIS Ukraine Fund directly to Kyiv at no cost to American taxpayers. The mechanism was authorized by a bipartisan U.S. law called the Repo for Ukrainians Act, championed by Senators Sheldon Whitehouse and Jim Risch. The whole system worked like a reverse mortgage. Russia kept the title to its money, but the interest payments went to fund the war it had started. Fast forward to June 2026, and that same UK ERA loan mechanism has evolved into something with real, direct military teeth. According to the Kyiv Independent and the UK's Defence Journal, a package worth £752 million, roughly $1 billion, was announced on June 18, 2026 by Defence Secretary Dan Jarvis at the NATO Defence Ministers meeting in Brussels. The package will deliver 150,000 Ukrainian-produced drones by the end of the year, along with more than 350 air defense missiles and radar systems, including lightweight multi-role missiles and ground-based radar units. Britain's Ministry of Defense framed the purpose bluntly. These are the very weapons used to defend Ukrainian civilians against Putin's barrage of drones and missiles. Notice what is actually happening here. Russia's own money, frozen the moment its tanks crossed the border, is now paying for the missiles that shoot down the very drones and missiles Russia keeps sending into Ukrainian cities. That specific drone and air defense package sits inside a much larger financial picture the UK has been building for years. According to the Kyiv Independent, the UK contributed a further £752 million of frozen Russian asset proceeds to Ukraine in April 2026 alone, part of a broader agreement between London and Kyiv to provide £2.26 billion, close to $3 billion, specifically for Ukraine's defense needs. Ukraine's own finance minister, Serhiy Marchenko, publicly thanked the UK government for what he called its consistent and resolute support in countering Russian aggression. That language reflects just how central this specific funding stream has become to keeping Ukraine's defense industry running, while entire European defense budgets argue about who pays for what. But the story did not stop at interest payments and standard loans. By September 2025, the ambition in London had grown considerably. And this is where the UK's approach started to separate itself from the more cautious path some of its European partners were taking. According to Politico Europe, Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced at a meeting of EU finance ministers in Copenhagen that the UK would explore using the full value of frozen Russian assets, not merely the interest they generate, to fund what officials began calling a reparations loan for Ukraine. Reeves put the logic in blunt, memorable terms. This is Russia's war, and Russia should pay. She described the UK's frozen Russian holdings at that point as roughly matching the total of around £21.8 billion Britain had already committed to Ukraine since the war began. A striking coincidence that Reeves used to argue that Russia's own money could in effect cover nearly the entire British contribution to defending the country it invaded. The mechanism behind that reparations loan concept is genuinely clever from a legal standpoint. According to the European Policy Center and the European Commission's own statements, rather than confiscating the underlying Russian assets outright, which would risk violating international law protections around sovereign immunity, the reparations loan concept keeps Russia's money formally frozen and untouched while using its cash value as collateral to raise a separate loan for Ukraine. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen explained the distinction directly, stating, "We are not confiscating the assets, but we are taking the cash balances for a loan to Ukraine. Ukraine would only repay that loan once Russia itself pays war reparations, an outcome that functionally may never arrive, meaning the loan could effectively become permanent in practice without ever technically confiscating a single ruble of Russian sovereign property." Naturally, Russia has not stayed quiet about any of this, and its objections say a great deal about just how much leverage this mechanism actually holds over Moscow. According to Reuters and the AP, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters directly that the EU's intentions amounted to plans to illegally confiscate Russian property. In Russian, he said, "We call that simply theft." Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov went further still, stating that Russia also retains the option of not returning funds that Western countries hold inside Russia before the war. A veiled threat to seize Western assets still sitting inside Russian territory as a retaliatory countermeasure. Here's exactly why those Russian threats carry far less weight than they might first appear. Moscow's entire objection rests on the claim that this represents illegal confiscation of state property. But the specific mechanism the UK and its allies have built, freezing the assets rather than seizing them, and borrowing against their cash value rather than spending the principal directly, was designed from the outset to avoid the exact legal violation Russia keeps accusing the West of committing. Peskov can call it theft as many times as he likes in front of a camera, but Russia has no functioning international court with jurisdiction to force restitution, no meaningful diplomatic leverage capable of reversing a G7-wide coordinated financial mechanism, and no realistic path to physically reclaiming money that never left Western custody in the first place. Threatening retaliation against assets still frozen inside Russia's own borders is a real option on paper, but it is one that mostly punishes remaining Western companies inside Russia rather than reversing anything happening in London, Brussels, or Washington. Russia can seize a few office buildings. It can fine a few Western banks, but it cannot reach into Euroclear's secure accounts in Belgium and pull out 191 billion euros. Not legally, not practically, not without the cooperation of every Western government in the alliance. It is worth being precise and fair, though, because not every government involved in this process has moved with the same confidence the UK has shown, and understanding that hesitation matters for judging how significant Britain's posture actually is. According to Lawfare's detailed analysis, the G7's internal diplomatic discussions since 2022 split sharply, with the United States eventually pushing hardest for outright seizure of the underlying assets, the United Kingdom gradually warming to that same, more aggressive position over time, while Germany and France remained adamantly opposed to anything resembling confiscation. They worried specifically about setting a precedent that could expose their own sovereign assets to retaliatory seizure elsewhere. That caution is not paranoia. It reflects a genuine unresolved legal debate that serious international lawyers continue to disagree about even as the political pressure to act keeps building. Belgium, the country hosting Euroclear and therefore holding the largest single share of frozen Russian assets anywhere in Europe, flatly rejected the European Commission's full €140 billion reparations loan proposal in December 2025. According to NPR reporting, Belgian Foreign Minister Maxime Prévost told reporters at NATO headquarters that his country considers the option of the reparations loan the worst of all. He described it as risky and unprecedented. He added pointedly that it was not acceptable to use the money and leave Belgium alone facing the risks. Belgian Prime Minister Bart De Wever went even further, demanding what he called full mutualization of financial risk and airtight guarantees from every single EU member state before he would give his blessing. He warned that if the plan went wrong, Belgium alone would not be able to cover a potential €140 billion liability. Even Euroclear itself, the financial institution that would actually hold and administer the loan, publicly broke with the European Commission's messaging, telling Euronews the proposal amounted to a great deal of legal innovation that raised serious questions. They described the entire construction as very fragile and warned it could trigger an exodus of foreign investors away from the Eurozone entirely. The stakes behind that Belgian resistance were not hypothetical. According to Reuters, Russia's central bank had already filed a lawsuit against Euroclear in a Moscow arbitration court in December 2025, seeking $230 billion in damages. A legal maneuver widely understood more as a political warning shot than a case with any real prospect of enforcement, since a Russian domestic court obviously has no jurisdiction to compel a Belgian financial institution to pay anything. Still, Belgium's fear centered on a different, more serious legal avenue entirely: arbitration under the Belgium-Russia Bilateral Investment Treaty, a genuine international mechanism where Russian state-linked entities could plausibly argue Belgium had violated investor protections, exposing Brussels to real financial liability regardless of how the underlying war eventually ends. Facing that deadlock, the European Council ultimately backed away from the full reparations loan model Belgium refused to accept. According to analysis published by the Max Planck Institute, EU leaders instead settled on a smaller compromise, a €90 billion loan for 2026 and 2027, financed through ordinary EU borrowing on capital markets, and secured by the EU's own budget, rather than being directly collateralized by the frozen Russian assets themselves. Crucially, that same analysis noted the European Council did not fully abandon the original concept either, explicitly stating in its own conclusions that the EU reserves its right to make use of the Russian assets to repay that loan in the future, in full accordance with EU and international law. Language that keeps the door open for the exact kind of asset-backed mechanism Belgium blocked, without forcing the issue while the legal risks remain unresolved. That European detour is precisely what makes the UK's own approach worth highlighting on its own terms. Separate from the broader stalled EU effort, Britain's ERA loan program, the one already funding 150,000 drones and hundreds of air defense missiles for Ukraine, was not caught up in Belgium's veto at all because it operates through an entirely separate G7 mechanism built specifically around the interest and windfall profits generated by frozen assets, rather than the underlying principle itself. In other words, while the EU's larger, more ambitious plan to tap the full value of Russia's frozen billions has spent the better part of a year stuck in legal and political gridlock among its own member states, the UK's narrower, already operating mechanism has kept moving forward the entire time, delivering real weapons to Ukraine's front line without waiting for that broader European fight to resolve itself. That internal disagreement is precisely why the reparations loan model, rather than outright seizure, became the compromised path forward, and why the UK's rhetoric has grown noticeably bolder, even while its actual legal mechanism has stayed relatively cautious, according to a joint statement on peace for Ukraine, reported by Reuters and the European Council. A Copenhagen summit on October 21, 2025, brought together Prime Minister Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, French President Emmanuel Macron, and President Volodymyr Zelensky. They co-signed a joint declaration stating they were ready to progress toward using in a coordinated way the value of the immobilized Russian sovereign assets to support Ukraine's armed forces and thus bring Russia to the negotiating table. They pledged to develop further bold and innovative mechanisms to increase the cost of Russia's war. Starmer also spoke directly with Zelensky following that summit, with Downing Street's official readout confirming that the UK, Germany, and France were united in wanting to drive progress toward using the full value of the immobilized Russian assets, specifically to end the war and secure a just and lasting peace. That is not just talk. Those three leaders control the largest pools of frozen Russian money outside Belgium, and they have now publicly committed to using it, in their own words, in a coordinated way. So when Moscow threatens retaliation, it is not just threatening Britain. It is threatening the three largest Western European powers acting together. So, what does all of this actually add up to strategically? The scale of the money at stake is genuinely difficult to overstate. According to the UK Parliament's own Hansard record from a November 2025 debate, close to $300 billion of Russian assets are frozen across G7 countries, which includes close to £30 billion inside the United Kingdom. One British MP argued in that same debate that seizing the UK-based assets outright could fill roughly half of Ukraine's projected $60 billion defense funding shortfall for 2026 alone, based on estimates from Ukraine's own defense minister, Rustem Umerov, who would put Ukraine's total 2026 defense spending need at around $120 billion, of which Ukraine could only cover about half domestically. That MP went further still, introducing a formal bill in the UK Parliament in January 2026, specifically calling for the outright seizure of frozen Russian assets connected to the Russian Federation. The bill would require the government to publish recommendations on using those funds for military reconstruction and humanitarian work inside Ukraine. A bill that, as of its parliamentary record, had been read a first time and scheduled for further reading, reflecting real ongoing political pressure inside Britain to go even further than the current reparations loan framework already allows. It is also worth stepping back to place the UK's specific role inside the much larger European picture, because Britain is a significant player here, but not the only one, and definitely not the largest holder of frozen Russian money. The largest pool of frozen assets by far, roughly 194 billion euros. As of June 2025, sits in Belgium, managed through Euroclear. Japan holds the next largest chunk, around $50 billion, with smaller amounts scattered across the United States, additional EU member states, and Canada. The European Commission's own broader reparations loan proposal, first outlined by von der Leyen in 2025, aimed to leverage that much larger Belgian-held pool to back a loan potentially reaching 140 billion euros. An amount Politico later reported the Commission was considering expanding by an additional 25 billion euros, drawn from private Russian accounts scattered across various EU member states. Ukraine's own defense and budget needs for 2026 and 2027 combined were estimated at approximately 130 billion euros, a figure the reparations loan mechanism, if fully implemented across the EU and UK together, could realistically come close to covering entirely. The urgency behind resolving this financing puzzle is not academic either. According to the European Parliament and the IMF, Ukraine's financing needs for 2026 reached 43 billion euros of international aid required, of which only 22 billion was firmly confirmed by late 2025. The IMF itself reached a staff-level agreement in November 2025 on a new $8.1 billion extended fund facility arrangement for Ukraine. Real-time pressure on a negotiation that might otherwise have dragged on indefinitely without consequence. Danish Finance Minister Stephanie Lose, chairing EU Finance Minister talks in her capacity as rotating Council President, described the Commission's reparations loan proposal as the best and most realistic option available and said it should be treated as a matter of highest priority. European Commissioner for the Economy, Valdis Dombrovskis, made a related point about the mechanism's core advantage over ordinary EU borrowing, arguing it would secure Ukraine's funding without placing what he described as an additional burden on member states with limited fiscal capacity, a genuinely important distinction for smaller and poorer EU economies wary of taking on new debt of their own to fund a war involving a much larger neighboring country. And then there is the position from President von der Leyen herself, stated in December 2025 in Brussels when unveiling the reparations loan plan. Ukraine will only pay back the loan once Russia pays for the reparations. The money will help Ukraine already today. That single sentence became the cornerstone of Brussels' rationale, lifting the mechanism out of a financial abstraction and into a clear moral claim. Russia caused the damage. Russia must pay for it. Every day that money sits frozen, untouched, is another day Ukrainian soldiers die waiting for weapons that could have been paid for yesterday. There is one more angle worth including here for a complete and balanced picture, because not everyone who supports helping Ukraine agrees this specific approach is the wisest one, and that internal debate deserves a fair hearing rather than being brushed aside. Some critics pointed out that any eventual formal reparations settlement covering the full sum involved would likely require what one commentator described as a generational reparation tax, something considered very uncertain to ever actually happen, given how far off any genuine peace settlement with Russia currently appears. Others raise a longer-term structural concern, drawing a historical parallel to how German assets were frozen and eventually returned at the end of the Second World War, warning that a precedent of permanently repurposing a sovereign nation's frozen reserves, however justified in this specific case, could carry risks for how other countries view the safety of holding their own reserves in Western currencies and institutions going forward. Analysis published by Fair Observer put that specific long-term risk in especially direct terms, warning that if the perception solidifies globally that euro-denominated assets are subject to political seizure, the euro's own status as a viable alternative reserve currency could diminish over the following decade, which would in turn raise borrowing costs across every European government simultaneously as global demand for European debt instruments softened in response. Belgium's specific resistance was framed not as sympathy for Moscow, but as a defensive warning against sacrificing long-term European financial credibility for comparatively short-term cash injection. However urgently Ukraine needs that money right now, a genuinely difficult trade-off, one where reasonable people who all want Ukraine to win this war can still land in very different places depending on how heavily they weight the immediate military need against the longer-term risk to the entire Western financial system's credibility. The trade-off has a genuine legal argument in its favor too. Analysis published by the European Policy Center argued that using the frozen assets for a loan is best understood not as expropriation at all, but as a countermeasure, a recognized concept under international law's own articles on state responsibility, which allow states to suspend specific obligations owed to a state that has itself committed a serious violation precisely in order to restore compliance with international law. Under that legal framework, the argument goes, Russia's invasion itself, a clear violation of obligations owed not just to Ukraine, but to the international community as a whole, is what justifies treating its frozen reserves differently than ordinary sovereign property would be treated under normal peacetime circumstances. Even if reasonable legal scholars, including Belgium's own government, continue to disagree about how far that countermeasure logic can safely be stretched before it starts to look like the exact confiscation everyone involved insists they're trying to avoid. Put all of this together, and the picture that emerges is neither simple confiscation nor empty symbolism, but something more clever and more consequential than either. The UK has not seized Vladimir Putin's money outright. It has been careful publicly and repeatedly to frame its approach in terms designed to survive international legal scrutiny. What it has done is turned Russia's own frozen fortune into a functioning ongoing pipeline of drones, missiles, and radar systems flowing directly into Ukrainian hands, funded by interest and loan mechanisms specifically built around money Russia cannot touch, cannot spend, and based on every available legal and diplomatic tool at its disposal, cannot meaningfully get back. Peskov can call it theft on Russian state television as often as he likes. Lavrov can threaten retaliation against Western companies inside Russia until he is hoarse. The reality is that Moscow started this war holding hundreds of billions of dollars in reserves it assumed were untouchable. And 4.5 years later, a meaningful share of that same money is now paying for the exact weapons being used to shoot down its own drones and missiles over Ukrainian skies. Russia is funding both sides of this war. It is funding the missiles it sends, and it is funding the missiles that shoot them down. That is not a legal technicality. That is Russia's own war chest being turned piece by piece against the war it was meant to fund. And remember how this works? The interest keeps accumulating. Every year Euroclear earns several billion euros more on those frozen Russian deposits. Every year that money goes out the door to Kiev, weaponized. Every year Kiev uses it to buy more drones, more air defense, more radar, more missiles. And every year the underlying Russian principle stays exactly where it was the day it was frozen, untouched, unseized, legally intact, but functionally completely disconnected from the war effort it was meant to fund. Putin cannot reach it. Putin cannot move it. Putin cannot even spend the interest. He cannot do anything with it except watch it be turned against him year after year in slow motion. That is why this story matters far beyond one banker's ledger. This is the most creative financial weapon ever wielded in a major war. It does not fire bullets. It does not fire missiles. But it funds the bullets and it funds the missiles that intercept the bullets. And it does all of that while remaining technically legal under international law, defensible before every court in Europe, and utterly beyond the Kremlin's reach. Look at the specific scale of what the UK alone is doing. 150,000 drones delivered by the end of 2026, 350 air defense missiles and radar systems, all on top of the broader £2.26 billion loan agreement signed in April 2026 by Chancellor Reeves and Finance Minister Marchenko. That is not a token gesture. That is a sustained, growing pipeline of frontline weapons designed specifically to counter Russia's nightly bombardment of Ukrainian cities. The math shows that this funding is more than symbolic. It is operationally decisive. Because every Russian Shahed drone intercepted by a lightweight multi-role missile bought with Russian interest payments is one fewer bomb landing on a school in Kharkiv. And the UK's commitment is only one slice. The full $50 billion ERA loan from the entire G7 has now been almost fully dispersed. The U.S. has paid out its $20 billion share through the World Bank's FORTIS fund. The EU supplied an €18 billion loan of its own. Canada, Japan, and the UK added smaller, but meaningful contributions. Combined, that loan has already been front-loaded into Ukraine's war economy, providing the kind of multi-year financial visibility that allows Kyiv to plan procurement, train brigades, and stock reserves. Without that loan, Ukraine would be negotiating every drone purchase, month by month, scrambling for cash, bleeding out by accident. With it, Ukraine has a war budget. So when you hear the next headline about a stalled peace negotiation or a frozen front line or another night of Russian drone strikes, remember this. Somewhere in Brussels, in London, in Berlin, in Tokyo, in Ottawa, the same money Russia thought was safely parked abroad is being quietly converted into the missiles that intercept those drones. The money itself has not moved. The legal title has not changed. But every month, a slice of its interest payments buys another batch of the very weapons Russia is trying to destroy Ukraine with. Russia is paying in the most literal sense for both sides of this war, and that is the trap. The Kremlin can complain. The Kremlin can threaten. The Kremlin can sue in Russian courts that no one recognizes. The Kremlin can confiscate Western assets inside Russia. But none of that reverses what is happening in Western bank accounts where Russia's money is being weaponized in slow, public, and entirely legal motion. There is no off-ramp for Putin here. There is no negotiation that gives him back the interest every year. And every month that the war continues, the interest earns more and the pipeline of weapons flowing into Ukraine grows longer. This is also why Belgium's veto of the broader EU reparations loan matters so much, but in a counterintuitive way. Belgium was not protecting Russia. Belgium was protecting the entire Western financial system's credibility from what it saw as an overreach. But that overreach, if it ever does happen, would be the moment Russia's frozen principle finally gets used directly, not just the interest. Belgium is currently standing in the way of the very thing Russia fears most. Belgium is, in effect, shielding Russia's capital from being fully consumed, even as Ukraine's allies want to consume it. That paradox is not lost on anyone watching. It is also not permanent, because political pressure on Belgium is mounting. The same NPR report noted that several EU countries have already agreed to provide financial guarantees should things go wrong. The Dutch foreign minister told reporters, "We understand the Belgian concerns, and we are willing to at least make sure that they are not alone in this." Germany's foreign minister added, "The issue can be resolved. It can be resolved if we are prepared to take responsibility together." The EU Council itself, in its December 2025 conclusions, explicitly left the door open to a future, more aggressive reparations loan model. That means Belgium's veto is a speed bump, not a wall. The political pressure is building. Legal arguments are being refined. The financial plans are being redrafted. And every month the war continues. The pressure to unlock the principle, not just the interest, grows stronger. Because every month the war continues, Ukraine's defense budget needs grow more urgent. And every month Ukraine's needs grow more urgent. The case for treating Russia's frozen principle as a reparations loan, not a frozen asset, becomes harder to argue against. What does the next phase look like? Honestly, here's the most likely scenario. The UK continues funding Ukraine's defense through ERA loan interest payments, with the current package of 150,000 drones and 350 missiles rolling out through 2026. Starmer pushes ahead with expanding the UK's reparations loan framework into something approaching a fuller use of frozen assets. The EU's €90 billion compensation loan, brokered in December 2025 as a fallback, rolls out through 2026 and 2027, providing the immediate budget support Ukraine needs to keep functioning. Belgium continues to resist the broader reparations loan, but slowly yields to political pressure to share the legal risk. And Moscow keeps paying interest into the same pile that funds the missiles shooting down its own drones. That is the short-term picture. The longer-term picture is harder to call, because if Russia and Ukraine ever do reach a settlement, the question of what happens to the frozen assets becomes central. Does the principal get returned as part of the deal? Or does it stay frozen indefinitely, with the interest continuing to fund Ukraine's reconstruction for years after the guns fall silent? No country has ever tried to use another country's frozen central bank reserves as a permanent reparations mechanism before. The precedent being set here will shape international finance for decades.